Farmers produce the food we all need, and they're at the front line of caring for God's creation. This is what I have in mind. Let's start by recognizing that farmers are already under pressure. Next, look at how the climate change agenda has developed over the past 30 years. Then consider it from several angles: the Bible, Christian tradition, and thirdly, reason or science, which also involves politics. Finally, I'm hoping to make a helpful response. The media often give the impression that farming is great fun, enjoying the countryside, driving around in big boys' toys and caring for cute animals. A slightly more realistic impression was given recently in Ben Fogle's programme about a local couple who retired as vets and began sheep farming to produce cheese. Sadly, farmers rarely receive the respect or the rewards they deserve. Many farmers feel under attack from journalists such as George Monbiot. The UK currently only produces half the food we need, and yet many fields are unused, whilst perfectly good agricultural land is being abandoned for rewilding. The climate change agenda is imposing targets on farmers all around the world to reduce carbon dioxide, nitrates, and other emissions. Dutch farmers are amongst the most productive in the world, and they are starting to fight back against targets that they believe are based more on political dogma than true science. The same is happening in Canada, where you may remember not long ago, Trudeau presided over a totalitarian regime against unvaccinated truck drivers. By 2030, the Irish government is planning to cut agricultural emissions, such as methane, by up to 25%. Irish farmers say they will be forced to cull 100 million cattle to meet climate targets, but already many farmers are expecting to go bankrupt. Much as we yearn for the fulfillment of God's kingdom, at present the world is dominated by financial considerations. During the recent global health scare, our government spent, or rather borrowed and printed, between 350 and 500 billion pounds, whilst imposing 3 lockdowns, which were like giving the UK economy a series of heart attacks. China and the Western economies treated the global health scare as though it was the re-emergence of the Black Death, and they are now using the same heavy-handed approach in their climate change agenda. Now let's move on to look at how the climate change agenda has developed over the past 30 years. The Earth is so far away from the Sun that the surface temperature here would be minus 20 degrees centigrade, but thankfully we have an atmosphere of water vapour and carbon dioxide which traps the sunshine and keeps us warm. However, there are a lot more factors at work than can be shown in such a simple diagram. Ever since 1988, the news media and the IPCC have been asserting that carbon dioxide emissions, starting a couple hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution, have warmed the Earth's atmosphere by about 1.5 degrees centigrade. The IPCC statistical models are predicting the end of the world as we know it, unless immediate and radical practical action is taken. In 1992, the UN's Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro formally recognised global warming. 11 years later, in 1998, the climate change agenda really accelerated with the publication of the now famous hockey stick graph. This was an attempt by Michael Mann and colleagues to reconstruct the average Northern Hemisphere temperature over the past 1,000 years based on tree rings and other indicators. It shows temperatures holding fairly steady until the last part of the 20th century and then suddenly shooting up. The graph was highlighted in the 2001 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In recent years, the graph has been discredited, but by then the vast majority of the population had been taken in. By 2007, propaganda about climate change had reached fever pitch. Al Gore, the former US Vice President, published a book and a video entitled An Inconvenient Truth. The next year, in 2008, the Climate Change Act committed the UK government to reducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions by at least 100% of 1990 levels. In other words, to reach net zero by 2050. Our politicians were able to proudly strut the world stage, but few voters were aware that this new law would impose carbon budgets, which in a worst-case scenario might come down to a family level and a tough choice between heating your home all winter or flying off for an overseas holiday. Alex Epstein's book really just states the obvious, that modern civilization has been built on fossil fuels, which can't suddenly be switched over to so-called green energy without plunging over 1 billion people into extreme poverty. The United Nations keeps publishing various goals intended to make the world a better place. Climate change is highlighted here and has an impact on several of the other 16 goals. Early in 2020, Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum, published a book which described the global health scare as an opportunity for banks and multinationals to bypass democracy by crashing the global economy and then rebuilding it. This project was called the Great Reset, otherwise known as the Green New Deal or the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Then in May 2020, none other than Prince Charles, now King Charles III, officially launched the Great Reset, thus giving the project credibility and authority all around the world. It's interesting that anyone who makes a YouTube video referring to the words climate change finds they have a link imposed directly, so that viewers take in the official narrative, which tends to dominate and crush any questioning. Let's look at a Christian analysis. First of all, joining the dots. Whatever are we to make of all this? Most of us, I think, are suffering from information overload because of 24/7 news, internet articles, and constant text messages. The problem is nicely illustrated by all these dots. How can anyone identify the most important and trustworthy information? The best way forward I can think of is to look in turn at the Bible, church tradition, and science. It would be nice if all three could agree. Starting now with, what does the Bible say? Well, the very first words in the Bible describe how God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light was good. Over 7 days or periods of time, God paused to look at what he'd created and always concluded it was good. By contrast, the Swedish teenager and well-known anarchist group are currently wanting everyone to panic about climate change. Many young people are now suffering from so-called climate anxiety. One of my clergy friends in Luton recently reported that the majority of today's school children think of themselves as belonging not to a beautiful species made in the image of the Creator, but rather to a parasitic race guilty of the crime of sinning against nature. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Quite obviously, the Bible doesn't specifically mention climate change or global warming or global heating or climate emergency or, more recently, climate breakdown. On the other hand, the Bible does have some teaching about the weather. For example, Jesus said, "When evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today, it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast." You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Back then, the Pharisees and Sadducees expected Jesus to validate his teaching by performing a miracle of some kind. However, in today's context, I believe Jesus expects us to know the Bible well enough that we can work out what's really going on in the world. Of all the Bible passages for these strange days we're living through, the one I keep coming back to is Matthew 24, where Jesus teaches his disciples about signs of the end times. Jesus said to his disciples, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is yet to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the birth pangs." Theologically, the end time started after Jesus ascended into heaven and will be concluded when he returns at the Last Judgment. Therefore, I think it's fair to say we are currently living in the last days of the last days. It's easy to spot some of today's false prophets. I could name a few high-profile politicians, but it's more difficult to spot false prophets who exercise spiritual power and authority. This calls for discernment, and we need to keep our focus on Jesus Christ and his words. This brings us to the second perspective. What does church tradition say? Well, the Christian church celebrates harvest every year, as well as various other agricultural festivals, including Plough Sunday, Rogation, Lammastide, and more recently, the season of creation. Some churches have even started to observe Climate Sunday, but thankfully this isn't yet in the lectionary. As well as the annual worship services, the CofE has also devised certain prayers about recurring weather conditions, which affect farmers in particular. For example, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer includes a humble petition seeking God's blessing of rainfall for the crops, whilst the 1928 BCP has a prayer asking the Almighty for a bit less rainfall. More generally, when things are going wrong, the first and proper response of the church has been self-examination and, if necessary, confession with repentance. Over the years, the peace movement has sadly adopted multi-faith worship, and now, in the same way, we see climate activists holding interfaith acts of worship. To my mind, this is a serious break with church tradition and points towards a new global religion where leaders will try to downgrade Jesus Christ from being the Son of God and turn him into a mere prophet in the hope of pleasing other religions. So, at last we come to what current science has to say. The most important point to make is that weather is different to climate. Weather patterns vary from day to day, whereas changes in global temperature can take 30 to 50 years before scientists can make reliable measurements. Sadly, such is the zeal of climate activists that extreme weather events are now being presented as evidence of climate change. Take, for example, the flooding in 2007-2008 around Tewkesbury Abbey in Gloucestershire. Tewkesbury sits at the confluence of the River Severn and the River Avon. The historical records going back to 1484 prove that modern-day flooding has nothing at all to do with climate change. Geologists have identified several mass extinction events during Earth's long history, several of which they believe were caused by the impact of comets. In geological terms, the Earth is currently coming out of the last ice age, which ended only about 10,000 years ago. As recently as the 1970s, meteorologists were warning of a global cooling, but then in the 1980s, they reinvented themselves as climatologists and made a complete U-turn with scary predictions of global warming. This diagram challenges the climate change agenda by showing there's been at least 75 major temperature swings over the past 4,500 years. Historical records prove there was a medieval warm period, followed by what was loosely called a Little Ice Age. The authors attributed global temperature changes not to carbon dioxide, but rather to volcanic activity, especially volcanoes hidden deep beneath the oceans. Violent volcanic eruptions, such as happened about 10 years ago in Iceland, obviously contaminate the atmosphere with dust clouds, whereas volcanoes that gently pour out lava tend to warm the earth. In recent decades, a growing number of global organizations have provided generous funding for climate scientists. However, the IPCC quite openly admits their scientists can't take account of natural variables such as the sun's orbit relative to the Earth, the impact of comets, volcanic activity, and the influence of ocean currents. All they can do is make estimates of human emissions and feed them into their statistical models, which usually turn out to be unreliable for predicting climate change. Even if there is a link between carbon emissions and temperature, this does not prove causation. Furthermore, the IPCC is an intergovernmental organisation where political delegates are told which way to vote, and this gives plenty of scope for tentative scientific findings to be amplified by the media in a most alarming way. Well, at this point, we're trying to join the dots. And it seems to me that the Bible and tradition encourages a sense of wonder and thankfulness to God, as well as caring for creation as a whole. However, in recent decades, the climate change agenda has been pushed in the name of following the science. Politicians are fear-mongering whilst playing down the costs. The recent health scare that I've referred to more than once cost £500 billion. And for the UK to reach carbon net zero by 2050, it is estimated this will cost at least twice as much. The result would be a mere 1% reduction in human-induced carbon dioxide emissions. In my opinion, the climate change agenda has become a false idol that will ultimately destroy not only farmers, but civilization as we know it. I want the CofE to call the nation to repentance while supporting the farming community as much as possible. The coordinated way that governments have handled the recent global health scare suggests that the global elite are following a hidden agenda, which is really about monitoring and control. Thank you.